Well, there's a number of challenges, both practical and kind of philosophical. Let's start with the practical. I mean, working in a situation of occupation presents a number of just daily challenges, such as going through checkpoints and dealing with the Israeli military and things like that. On a bigger level, what goes on in Israel-Palestine is a very strong narrative from both sides, from the Palestinian and the Israeli. And in the West, there tends to be a kind of dominance of the Israeli narrative. So when I say the Israeli narrative dominates the Western discourse, I mean that when we think in the West about Israel-Palestine, we tend to think about the issue as one being about security or peace between two kind of equal or semi-equal factions that are at war with each other, the Palestinians and the Israelis. When in fact, what's going on, at least in my view, is much more of a human rights struggle, a situation in which one side is not equal with the other, and therefore there's a struggle for those rights, those human and civil rights. And so this narrative that exists is very, very strong, and penetrating that narrative with factual discourse from the ground is probably the most significant challenge that I face in my work as a journalist. Well, picking a story is not an issue in this area because there's plenty of stories that just seem to fall through the cracks of the mainstream media. What I find as a barrier sometimes is getting those stories published. And so I'll give you an example. Recently, there was a prisoner exchange between Israel and the Palestinian, like the PLO, in which one Israeli soldier was returned to Israel from Hamas, and over 1,000 Palestinian prisoners were released. And so I thought it would be a good time to write a story about the conditions that Palestinian prisoners are kept inside Israeli prisons, because it was topical, and it's also an incredibly interesting story about the nature of Israeli prisons and how they function, what laws they break, what laws they don't break, and just the entire experience as a whole. And this had no currency in the Western press. It was very, very difficult to get anything pushed through on this angle. And so that's just one of the barriers. But because of the social media platforms like blogging and Twitter, that story can get out there. I mean, I might not be able to get paid for it, which is a difficulty as a journalist. But in terms of like writing the story just so that the information is exchanged, that is not a problem because I can just put it on a blog or I can put it on a shared blog or something like that, and it will go around and people will read it. And so it's kind of twofold. It's a dynamic time because like I said, there's a lot more voices, which is always a good thing, because just about anyone can open a blog or a Twitter account and start reporting on what he or her sees. But that makes it difficult because that means there's a lot more bullshit. And so, the reader or the consumer has to be a little bit more discerning in analyzing the news and taking all of these components that exist: YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, blogging, mainstream media, newspaper websites, all of this kind of stuff, and kind of put it together. I mean, I often tell people that Twitter, as an example, is very good. So if there's a demonstration happening on a Friday in the West Bank, one can open a Twitter account, can follow the Israeli army spokesman.
Right.
The Israeli army has given a couple of soldiers iPhones so that they're tweeting, and then they can follow Palestinians and make their own decision because they can watch in live time commentary on the event from people that are part of the event from both sides. And so this is a really exciting kind of opportunity for the West. No, it's not a policy thing. I mean, basically, they gave a couple of high-ranking Israeli soldiers who happen to be immigrants, so from English-speaking countries, iPhones, and told them to tweet because Twitter has become an area in which the Israeli narrative is very much being challenged. And so if you take a demonstration in a small village against the separation barrier or its placement, these are Palestinians that are embracing unarmed resistance because of the deprivation of their human and civil rights, and they're tweeting about it, and people are listening. And so Israel is frantically putting soldiers, keep in mind these are the people that are carrying guns and things like that, putting soldiers and tweeting, opposite propaganda, saying that the unarmed protesters are violent and saying that they're against the status quo and that they're against peace and all sorts of other things. And so you can see this has really become like a major avenue of combating, each side in the virtual landscape. But like I said, the really positive thing is that we can all see it for ourselves. We can watch both Twitter feeds and compare and contrast. What I've done with my Twitter feed is I've tried to embrace a very simple model when I cover these demonstrations, and that is that I report only what I'm seeing. And so that means if I'm seeing a Palestinian throwing a stone at an Israeli soldier, I'm going to try and take a photo and say they're throwing stones. If I see an Israeli soldier, shooting a Palestinian in the head with a rubber bullet, I'll report that the same, and so on. And so there's a lot of hot air involved, and my position in the whole thing is to just kind of just give a very cold perspective of what's happening through my eyes on the ground. And there are other people that are trying to like do this slowly. But basically, this is part of the platform, is that there's a certain intimacy of the platform. And so if you really want to have like an honest look into a demonstration through Twitter, you have to kind of follow the people involved and get to know their personality. So if you follow one of these IDF people and then you follow like a prominent Palestinian and you read what they're saying during the week and the kind of viewpoints that they're putting out, it tends to, it's usually reflected in how they're reporting the demonstration. And so like if you take this army guy, he's saying really just over the top kind of ridiculous things that even a basic analysis of the conflict would basically prove incorrect. And so you can see that when he goes to these demonstrations, he's also tweeting really kind of inflammatory, bullshit, for lack of a better word. And the same can be said for some of the Palestinians that are tweeting really over the top, radical criticism against Israel. And yet there is a kind of middle ground, and it's not that hard to kind of, if you have a good head on your shoulders, it's not that hard to kind of get a good sense of what's going on.